until this point, I've looked at games that are easy to look at, to a degree. And this hasn't been a thing on purpose, I just looked at these games because I like them or thought they'd make for a good review. But as I go through my collection and look at some of my all-time favourites, I realise a lot of them are very complex games. And even if they're not complex, a lot of them are really hard to explain in a coherent reviewing context. Today's game just happens to be both of those things. Today's game is one of my all-time favourites. It's in my top 5, if not my top 3. I'm of course talking about the gaming masterpiece that is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. If you ask me, even with GTA 5 being a thing, as well as all of the other great open world or sandbox style games, I think GTA San Andreas can still hang with the best of them. And if someone turned around to me and said, hey, I think it's the greatest game of all time, I wouldn't necessarily disagree. And today I want to try and dissect this game to the best of my ability and see why it holds up so well and what made it such a great game at the time. Like I said, this game is quite hard to look at and review. There's so much content to unpack and it's a landmark title. So I'm going to try my best to do this game justice because it damn well deserves it.
Usually I tackle a game's story first when I review it, giving a brief summary of it or just rushing through it and mentioning the important bits. But of course for this review I'm going to take a bit of care with how I tackle the story, because the story is a big reason why this game is as great as it is. Some would even argue this game would be nothing without the story. So I'm going to take extra care to try and unpack the story and explain why the plot is so great and how it aids the game greatly. The game opens with a location and a date on screen, as you are greeted with a scene in an airport, overhearing a phone call between our protagonist Carl Johnson, or CJ, and his brother Sweet.
It is during this conversation that we learn of their mother's passing, which is the reason for CJ's departure from Liberty City to return to the fictional state of San Andreas. While it may not feel like it in the moment, this short section of the opening cutscene, while not initially all that striking, is an excellent way to set up the story going forward. It was quite a dramatic and almost cinematic way to open the game, and it makes what follows even more impactful.
Well, on the way back home, CJ's cab is stopped by the main antagonist of the game, Crash, a band of cops consisting of officers Hernandez, Pulaski, and Tenpenny. They arrest him and put him in the back of their cop car after taking his money and chewing away his cab, and then basically leave him for dead on the side of the road after some interrogation and harassment.
And you've really got a feel for CJ in this situation. I mean, you learn he initially left for Liberty City because he was blamed for his brother's death. Most of his friends died while he was in Liberty City. His mum just died, forcing him to come back to San Andreas. And now he's just been robbed and harassed by the police.
Regardless, CJ kinda just shrugs it off and just hops on a random bike and heads home, which leads to the start of the first real mission.
Now don't worry, I'm not going to go over every mission in some patronising way, trying to explain it to you like you're a child. Just the important stuff, and as you guys can imagine, these next few missions are very important to the story.
So carrying on with the story, CJ decides to take a seat after arriving at his house and stares longingly at a picture of his mum, when all of a sudden he's met by a particularly large man with a baseball bat, who we learn is Big Smoke, a childhood friend of CJ's.
Big Smoke has gone on to be a fan favourite of the franchise, and it's for good reason. I mean, he's quite a layered and interesting character. He feels like a real person. In fact, a lot of the supporting cast does.
Most if not all of the characters you meet along the journey, especially the main cast of characters, are phenomenal. They're all brimming with life and personality. They don't feel like tropes. Again, they feel like real characters. You don't look at the characters in the game and say, oh, that's a good guy, that's a bad guy, and that's a funny guy. You know their names and you know what they're about, and you remember the finer details about them. Like how Big Smoke always seems to talk in riddles, almost like a poet, for example. You grow to care about these characters, even the ones you hate, because you hate them so much you want to see them fall, which in turn means you care. And this is great because it adds weight to every part of the story. Every character interaction feels like it's important, even if characters are having what would usually be a throwaway exchange.
A protagonist is only as strong as their supporting cast, and in CJ's case, he has the strongest in the franchise. It's no wonder this story is as great as he is.
Speaking of the supporting cast, going back to the story, once Smoke and CJ get reacquainted, they head to the cemetery to meet up with their friends. This is where we meet Sweet, CJ's stern but loving brother, Ryder, a friend of CJ's with a bad attitude and a striking resemblance to Easy Motherfucking E, and Kendall, CJ's sister, who at this point in the story is somewhat unimportant. After Kendall storms off following an argument with Sweet about a new boyfriend Caesar, The gang decide to leave the cemetery, only to experience a drive-by shooting at the hands of their rival gang, the Ballers. CJ and his friends decide to hop on some nearby bicycles and flee back to their turf, while trying to not get gunned down on the way back. After this, in true GTA fashion, you play through a bunch of missions which don't really progress the story but more so provide character development, as well as serve to teach the player about certain mechanics and features present in the game, such as being able to go to the gym, eating, character customization, tagging, performing drive-bys, and doing these weird DDR lowrider missions. Speaking of which, it's actually during the lowrider competition you get to meet Kendall's new boyfriend, Caesar Villalpando. While CJ's initially skeptical of Caesar, he soon realises he's a pretty cool guy. You only really see Caesar a couple more times before the next section of the game, once during a race, which is pretty intense if you're not ready to take it on, and also during the final mission of the first act, but we'll talk about that later.
I'll be completely honest, Caesar is probably my favourite character in the game, and it's actually quite hard to pick a favourite in this game because all the characters are so layered and well written, like I said. But I'll probably go for Caesar, and I'll go into why a little later on, but first I've got to tackle the next new character.
The next new character you meet is the insufferable Jeffrey, or as he likes to be referred to as, OG Loke. A wannabe gangster rapper who in reality hasn't committed any crimes to even warrant a gasp from even the most uptight of people. All Loke has ever really done is petty crimes like traffic violations. Even CJ points out Jeffrey's whole shtick is a front.
Look at this fool, man. Perpetrating like he banging.
Think he hard. Look at him.
Boy, I tell you.
OG Loke is honestly one of my least favourite characters from the game. He'll have the occasional funny moment, but for the most part, he's loud, obnoxious, dumb, and wildly untalented. All of the missions he assigns you are also fucking annoying and obnoxious, minus Mad Dog's rhymes, which is pretty fun.
Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim these missions were made the way they were made just to fit the general vibe of OG Loke, but I wouldn't be surprised if Rockstar just turned around and slapped all the annoying early game missions on OG Loke and called it a day.
Regardless, not long after you're done with OG Loke's BS, you receive a call from a familiar voice. It's your old pal Frank Tenpenny, and he's called upon you to do all of his dirty work for him, which is just great. Up until this point, the members of Crash have been calling you to harass you, and have also been showing up during missions, but now they're getting you involved in their bidding, which really rubbed me the wrong way as a kid.
You see, with Tenpenny and his crew, their build as antagonists has been perfect, because with them constantly popping up to harass you just like they did at the start of the game, it builds that hatred over time and gives you a real understanding of what kind of low-life scum you're dealing with.
After doing a couple of missions for the Crash team, all you have left to do in the Los Santos section of the game is to do some missions with your brother Sweet, where you push back against the rival gang the Ballers in an attempt to reassert Grove Street's dominance and former glory. And you succeed. Up until the final mission of the first act. Up until this point, the Ballers have dominated Los Santos by selling drugs in mass, something Grove Street families were strictly against. While there was some division in the families while CJ was away, with his efforts, the families are back together and Grove Street is now ready to take back Los Santos.
It feels really good watching everything come together because it feels like you're making a real change. But before long, it's all ripped away from you during the mission, the Green Saber.
The mission opens with Sweet and the gang planning an attack on the Ballers. Once you leave Sweet's house ready to fight, you're stopped in your tracks by a call from Caesar. Caesar insists that CJ has to come and see something quickly, and after some convincing, CJ bites and goes through with it. It is here where we see one of the most infamous moments in GTA history. While sitting in a car with CJ, Caesar points out a crack house not too far away from where they're parked. Out of this crack house stumble some Ballers, closely followed by Big Smoke and Ryder of all people, and then offers a Tenpenny.
While some may have seen this plot twist coming a mile off, a lot of the people who grew up with the game didn't, myself included.
While Ryder had been sort of shady throughout the game, Big Smoke, by many, was seen as a loving and caring figure who cared deeply for Carl, so this betrayal comes out of left field in a way. This betrayal is made even worse by the fact that when CJ sees Big Smoke and Ryder exit the house, he notices a Green Saber, the car that was used in the drive-by that killed his mum. In the San Andreas introduction movie that was featured in the special edition of the game, it's revealed that it was actual Ballers that did the job, and not Big Smoke and Ryder like some would have assumed. But this doesn't make the betrayal any better because you then realise Smoke and Ryder basically let all this happen. Carrying on with the remainder of the mission, CJ remembers Sweet was on his way to kill some ballers and realises he's walked into a trap. He tells Caesar to take Kendall to a safe place and then sets off to save Sweet. On the way to see Sweet, CJ tries frantically to call him, but gets no answer. When he reaches him, he finds him wounded and decides to stay by Sweet's side and kill all of the ballers in the area, knowing full well he'll get arrested alongside Sweet. After taking out the ballers, the cops show up and arrest Sweet and CJ. Not long after, CJ wakes up in the back of Tenpenny's car with a bag over his head. Tenpenny then sets him free in the middle of nowhere, but then tells him he has to kill an informant.
This is a pretty powerful sequence of events and is a massive turning point in the story. All you thought you knew about your gang is brought into question. All of the characters you cared for are brought into question. If you bought into the characters in the fashion the game wanted you to, specifically CJ and his family in this case, your mind is probably racing as to what else might be a lie.
And on the way to save Sweet, you really feel a level of tension as you think about what CJ may be feeling as you put yourself in his shoes. After so much loss, you don't want to see CJ lose anyone else. And again, it's a very powerful sequence, especially in a franchise that barely takes itself seriously at the best of times. This whole sequence marks the end of the first section of the game, and is the beginning of the second, and is a great way to set up the second act, but we'll get into that a little bit later. I've neglected to talk about the graphics, which a lot of you probably think are quite dated. And in all honesty, I can't disagree, the graphics aren't the best by today's standards. There's a lot of popping, especially with the PS2 version, and some textures aren't really what the modern gamer would really accept as being even passable. But for the time, they were pretty good, and the fact that the game runs great more often than not is a testament to how much care went into the game, in terms of making it look good and play good. While a lot of people meme and clown on the weird polygonal hands of the characters, as well as the general look of the game, the look and scale of this game was genuinely groundbreaking for the time. Although I should clarify, the footage you guys are seeing is from the PC version. The PS2 version doesn't look as good, but I prefer it in some ways. The developers really went all out. The sheer size of this game is impressive. There's a lot of great and intricate detail in almost every area of the game. Speaking of the areas, there are so many memorable locations. Grove Street, Area 69, Glen Park, the Four Dragons Casino, Vinewood, Bone County, the list goes on. The state of San Andreas really does feel alive. If I had to pick a favourite city, I'd probably choose Los Santos, but it's a really close call because all of the areas are great, like I said. On the topic of Los Santos, when people mention San Andreas, the first thing a lot of people think about is the first part of the game. And understandably so, as I mentioned just a second ago, Los Santos is full of memorable locations, but on top of that, the early game is expertly put together.
You see, the first few missions serve as a tutorial of sorts, only really suggesting what you should do rather than telling you in a patronising fashion like many modern games. This is great for the player because it prepares them for the adventure going forward and basically tells them in no uncertain terms that they're not going to be getting their hand held.
This is great because with some of these easy early game missions come slight difficulty spikes, and while usually difficulty spikes would be a bad thing, thanks to GTA's mission by mission formula, San Andreas can pull off sudden difficulty spikes with elegance. When you reach these difficulty spikes, you're oftentimes rewarded for overcoming them. For example, you may unlock a new side mission mode, like burglary missions or street races. This is great because it rewards the player and incentivizes them to surpass what they think their limits are in the game, and work to beat whatever particularly tough mission they might be on. Infamous missions like Wrong Side of the Tracks, Home Invasion and Catalyst serve as a great setup for the game going forward, and shows the player that they need to be on their toes when they play the game, and better learn the controls or how to manage certain situations, or they're gonna have a bad time. Speaking of infamous missions, this early part of the game has a lot of memorable missions, whether they were memorable for how hard they were, such as the aforementioned Wrong Side of the Tracks, or because they were remembered for how fun they were, or because of funny and memorable cutscenes, like Just Business or Drive-Thru.
The latter of which features Big Smoke's Order, which is an iconic moment in the game and has kind of taken on a life of its own in internet and pop culture. In all honesty, this whole game was kind of a pop culture milestone, and it continues its legacy today, whether it's people remembering it for the iconic characters, like the aforementioned Big Smoke, or remembering it for the controversies like the hot coffee mod or the war against violent video games. This game really set the bar for what an open world game could be and should be, I keep raving about the scope of the game, but it cannot be understated. GTA 3 and Vice City set the bar really high for San Andreas, but I think San Andreas knocked it out of the fucking park. It's definitely the most polished out of the three in terms of gameplay and graphics.
Cars drive a lot smoother, on-foot movement is a lot more responsive and less jagged. The character models, while still very polygonal and dated, as mentioned before, are nowhere near as bad as what we had in 3. And with all of that considered, again, the sheer fucking size of this world. Jesus Christ. You have 3 major cities, Los Santos, San Fierro and Las Venturas, and all of these have their own unique and distinct vibe, with memorable locales sprinkled throughout. And not only that, but you get to revisit Liberty City, if very briefly. You also have other smaller areas on the outskirts of the major cities that serve as both transitional areas and as their own landmarks of sorts. While these areas are kinda counted as parts of their respective cities, they're definitely their own areas and have their own vibe.
Speaking of vibes, these areas really feed into and enhance the theme and vibe of the game, which would be the 90s West Coast hip hop scene.
For those unaware, the 90s was a weird decade to say the least. Whether it was TV, fashion, or music, it was all just weird and dark. And one of the main cultural focuses of the 90s was the West Coast hip hop scene, primarily gangster rap. While the 90s was arguably one of the last, if not the last decade to truly have a decent level of diversity in terms of popular music, it was fairly obvious in the 90s, gangster rap was king. So it made complete sense for Rockstar to focus on the gangster lifestyle, or at least what the gangster lifestyle was portrayed as for a GTA game set in the 90s. And as I explained going over the first act, you really get a feel for what it's like to be in a gang and part of the Grove Street families. You grow to love and appreciate your companions, and over the course of the first act, the player realises the gang members are real people, with real lives and emotions, and while their lives are entrenched in the gangster lifestyle, and that likely won't change, you do learn that they feel sadness, anger, happiness, and other human emotions, because they're people too. The game treats the gang members as humans and actually humanises gangsters in the real world, but doesn't portray them in too much of a positive light. Oftentimes, the limited and almost tunnel vision like ghetto mindset is highlighted, reeling the player back and letting them know while the lifestyle is cool, it's not something to aspire to because it's usually pursued by people who aren't smart enough to tackle the real world. This focus on the gangster lifestyle of the 90s and the things surrounding it was captured very well by Rockstar, and the nuance with which they chose to tell the story is commendable. And not only did they focus on the gangster lifestyle, but they also portrayed a gangster getting out of the hood, if by no other choice, and succeeding and realising the world is bigger than the neighbourhood, which perfectly segues into the next part of the story, so let's get back into it. Immediately after Carl kills the informant Tenpenny wanted him to, he gets a call from Caesar telling him to meet his cousin. Carl arrives at the bar Caesar told him his cousin would be at, and is surprised to learn his cousin is actually a woman called Catalina. A crazy woman at that.
I'm gonna be upfront with you guys, I hate Catalina. She's one of the most annoying and whiny characters in the game, and unlike most of the shitty and annoying characters in this game, spoiler alert, she don't even get a comeuppance.
Her missions aren't great either. While they are sometimes entertaining, for the most part, what would be a challenging yet rewarding mission is made infinitely worse by Catalina's incessant ranting and raving. But it's plainly obvious this was the intent behind Catalina's character. She was designed to be a whiny and annoying stick in CJ's craw, and I tip my hat to Rockstar because they fucking succeeded. Catalina rarely displays a lot of psychotic tendencies during her missions, and it all comes to a boiling point during your 4th visit to her hideout. She goes off on CJ about something, says she doesn't love him anymore, and then decides to move on. Oh wait, yeah, that reminds me. Catalina and CJ start dating.
I'm not sure how or why this happens, but CJ and Catalina go through the stages of a failing relationship within the span of 4 missions. 4 fucking missions. But you know what? It's whatever. Fuck it, I'm done talking about Catalina, she fucking sucks. But luckily, we meet 2 new kind faces, some of my all-time favourite GTA characters, The Truth and Woozy Moo, otherwise known as Woozy. I'll start with The Truth.
The Truth is a cool hippie dude, most likely based off of Willie Nelson, who owns a pot farm, and is just a bundle of fun any and every time he's on screen. Carl is initially apprehensive when meeting The Truth, but eventually warms up to him. The Truth is a totally whacked out conspiracy theorist, and some of his missions and your interactions with him reflect that. You meet the Truth through Tenpenny of all people, and when you initially meet him, the Truth tells you he needs help harvesting some weed for Tenpenny. This turns out to be a setup, but more on that in a bit. Moving on to Woozie. Woozie's a blind triad leader you meet during a race Caesar invites you to. Upon defeat, he congratulates you and invites you to work for him.
Woozie is a really chill character and he's a breath of fresh air in this crazy game. He's simultaneously the most out of place character and also the most fitting character for the game. While he's a legit criminal like most of the cast, he's actually quite gentle and kind-hearted. I mean, if he was a real person, he's just the kind of dude you want to be friends with.
Another race takes place right after the one you beat Woozie in, and CJ learns he's racing against Catalina. Upon defeat, she gives him a deed to a garage in San Fierro as a pink slip. Before CJ can set off to San Fierro, he gets a call from the Truth. The Truth tells him he has the weed for Tenpenny. CJ arrives, and after a short exchange, the Truth notices the sound of a chopper. He decides he and CJ need to burn all of the weed. So they get rid of it, blow up the chopper, and flee to the garage in San Fierro.
This particular section of the second act is great because it provides a player with a certain level of isolation, but also tries its best not to alienate the player too much. You're accompanied by some familiar faces in Kendall and Caesar, but there's a certain level of uncertainty just looming over CJ's head, and the player can really feel it. The uncertainty comes from not knowing what the future holds for CJ. Is he going to go back to Liberty City? Is he going to try and reclaim Los Santos? Or is he going to start anew somewhere else in San Andreas? This really gets a player guessing as to what CJ's next move will be. But even though CJ's alone to a degree, he's comforted by the fact that he's making a few new friends like Woozie and the Truth, who seem to have his back to a degree. This section of the game is also great because it sets up the remainder of the second act quite well, because this is where things pick up for CJ.
CJ arrives at the garage he won from Catalina alongside the Truth, Kendall and Caesar, and is initially extremely pissed off because the garage is nothing like he thought it would be. After some encouragement from Kendall to make the garage work, CJ agrees but doesn't know where to start. Luckily, the Truth has some friends who can help Carl out: Dwayne, Jethro and Zero. Dwayne and Jethro are basically background characters in the truest sense of the word, but Zero has his own shop and you can do missions to gain ownership of it.
Luckily, these missions are optional because while I do love this game, I'm ready to admit a lot of this game's missions are really fucking annoying.
Especially Zero's missions. The first three in particular, air raid and supply lines, are as infamous as wrong side of the tracks when it comes to difficult missions in the game. The only real difference to me is, wrong side of the tracks is easy as fuck as long as you don't suck at the game. Whereas these two missions, while equally as manageable, are a victim of the game's somewhat dated controls, but I'll talk about the controls a little later. Carrying on with the plot, once CD gets the garage set up and does a little more of Crash's bidding, he gets a call from Caesar and they decide to meet up and scope out one of Big Smoke's meetings to see if there's a way they can infiltrate the operation and take it down from the inside. CJ captures some pictures of a few new faces and, after some help from Woozie and his assistant, identifies these new faces as the Loco Syndicate, and two of them as Jizzy B, a big-time pimp and strip club owner, and T-Bone Mendez, a hard-nosed heavy who doesn't take shit from anybody. However, one of these people can't be identified. All Woozie's assistant knows is that he runs the whole operation. After finding this out, CJ starts to work for Jizzy as a means to infiltrate the operation, and after some time he also gets to meet T-Bone Mendez and that random white dude who turns out to be Mike Torino. In between working for Jizzy, CJ also works for his new good friend Woozie and earns the respect of the Triads by basically single-handedly taking down the Vietnamese gang, the Da Nang Boys. After working for the Syndicate for a bit, CJ invades the Pleasure Dome, Jizzy's strip club, and kills him during a car chase. CJ then meets Caesar at Pier 69 to crash a Loco Syndicate meeting, and with the help of some of Woozie's Triads, CJ and Caesar take down a bunch of ballers, as well as T-Bone Mendez. Ryder is also at this meeting and tries to escape, but CJ is on his tail and blows up his boat, killing him in the process.
This death feels anticlimactic but also kind of epic. While you do get the rush of taking out all of the ballers and Mendez and chasing Ryder on a speedboat, the way Ryder, such an important early game character, dies just doesn't sit right with me. It's so out of nowhere. No big showdown, no confrontation or explanation for motives, just boom and he's gone.
I honestly feel like Ryder's death should have been given a tiny bit more weight to it, but I can see why it was done in this fashion, because the game's already getting quite long at this point, and it's done in this big takedown style mission, so it makes sense, and it's probably one of the best ways it could have been executed.
And while we're talking about this mission, I'd like to take some time to just fully appreciate Caesar's character arc.
While Caesar's character arc is far from the most complex in the game, it's still a great one. He goes from being nothing but Kendall's new boyfriend that CJ has to keep an eye on, to basically feeling like CJ's long-lost brother. Caesar and Carl's friendship grows a lot throughout the game. Even when things are at their worst, Caesar is still by CJ's side, and as stated earlier, he and Kendall serve as a safety blanket of sorts for CJ, helping him feel less alone while he's away from home.
And not only that, Caesar is basically ready to help CJ at every turn. It's no wonder he grew to be one of my favourite characters in the game.
Right after taking out the local syndicate, CJ takes out Torino, who escaped the initial ambush, by blowing up his plane. He then finds Smoke's dope lab and decides to blow it up too, effectively putting a massive dent in the operation. Shortly after this, CJ receives a phone call from a mysterious voice saying he has some info about Sweet. CJ arrives at a ranch in the middle of nowhere and is met by Mike Torino, who apparently didn't actually die and is a government agent. He goes on about how CJ is ruining his plans and then basically blackmails him into working for him.
His methods of persuasion aren't too dissimilar to that of Tenpenny's, but the main difference is Torino's is more of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing, whereas Tenpenny kind of just has you by the balls for the whole game. I'm very iffy on Torino, because while he is very well written, over the course of the game he does get quite annoying, and I mean in a, oh, not this guy again kind of way.
Regardless of how you feel about Torino, you end up doing a few jobs for him, and then he asks you to buy the abandoned airstrip in Verdant Meadows. He then calls you to tell you need to learn how to fly. The only problem is, flying kinda sucks. Well, it doesn't suck. It's actually kinda fun, it's just hindered by some dated controls.
There's no better time to talk about the controls, so I guess I'll touch on them now. In general, the game's controls are pretty great if you ask me. Dated? Of course, it's a PS2 game, but I think they still work very well.
On foot, CJ controls really well, and I'd argue he controls a lot better than Tommy Vercetti did in Vice City. The controls are simultaneously clunky yet smooth. It's a victim of its age, but it's still functional. Aiming can be sort of stiff at times admittedly. Luckily, for the most part, the console versions have an auto-aim function, making gunfights a lot more bearable. However, sniper rifles and RPGs have manual aim, and it can be really annoying to properly line them up. So I stray away from using them if possible, unless I can get away with aiming close by rather than directly at the target, which, unfortunately in most missions, isn't really an option. As I mentioned a while ago, the cars control a lot smoother. Almost every on-road vehicle has its own unique characteristics, such as weight and handling, which makes driving interesting. While the bikes do take a while to get used to, they're very easy to understand and handle once you get a proper grasp. Unfortunately, not every vehicle in this game was built equal, some particular examples being the quad bike and Zero's model plane. The quad bike feels like trying to ride a coked up mutant that's running on all fours. It's a weird in-between of the cars and the bikes in the game, which does sound about right, but the problem is it doesn't control right. Something about the quad bike is just off. It doesn't feel right. Speaking of not feeling right, let's talk about Zero's plane. Zero's model plane seems to be a good idea on paper, but the controls are just as flimsy as the design looks.
I'll give it to Rockstar, this shot did make it feel like you're flying a toy plane. But that doesn't mean it's pleasant to control. Luckily, the real thing is a lot easier, but that doesn't make these flying school missions any easier. You see, while the pacing of the game has been fine and has flowed well, when you reach these plane missions, the game slows down to a fucking crawl.
Especially if it's your first playthrough of the game. If you're lucky, you'll have enough of an understanding of the game's physics to the point where you can kinda figure out the controls on your first try, but even then it's highly likely you'll fail at least one of the lessons a number of times. While the playing controls are quite questionable, I should stress that they're in no way horrible. But being backed into this corner and being forced to take these lessons can be really fucking annoying for the player.
But it does kind of fit into the love-hate relationship CJ and Torino have, because while it's obvious they're far from friends, it's painfully apparent that they kind of need each other, especially after CJ proved himself to Torino.
After CJ learns to fly and does some missions for Torino, the Truth turns up randomly at the airstrip being his whacked out self and asks CJ for some favours. So CJ obliges and steals a jetpack from Area 69 and then uses that very same jetpack to steal alien juice from a moving train. I've got nothing. Not long after this, CJ gets a call about Uzi opening up a new casino in Las Venturas. So he makes his way there, and when he arrives, he's told by Uzi that he's giving CJ partial ownership of the casino. Uzi also informs CJ that the Mafia are giving him some trouble, so CJ sets out to infiltrate the Sindaco family-run Caligula's casino. And he succeeds, with help from the Truth of all people. Indirect help I might add, but help nonetheless. The Truth calls CJ asking him to help out his friends who are lost in the desert. Maka, the lead singer of fictional band The Gurning Chimps, and his manager/producer, Kent Paul.
Maka and Paul are fucking hilarious. For characters introduced so late into the game and with such little time to build any real character, they exhibit a huge amount of charm. Sure, a lot of their moments involve some preschool level humour at times, but looking at Rockstar for anything other than lowbrow humour is like looking at, I don't know, the Billboard charts for good music.
Anyway, CJ takes Maka and Kent to Caligula's casino, and here he meets Ken Rosenberg, who you recognise if you played Vice City, and you'll be glad to know he's as pathetic as ever. Thanks to CJ's new connections, he gets in with Mafia boss Salvatore Leone, and after doing some work for him and helping Rosenberg and the boys escape to Los Santos, CJ basically has everything in place to pull off the perfect heist. Although before you go through with the heist, you've got to do a bunch of heist setup missions. These heist setup missions are pretty fun, but they can also be really annoying. But basically all of them are optional, so if you really want, you can skip them. Although the story may feel a little incomplete without the double cross taking place, so I'd recommend at least trying them. Not long after meeting Salvatore Leone, Carl has some work to do for Crash, because of course he fucking does. But luckily, the mission High Noon leads to one of the most satisfying moments in the whole game. The mission before this one, Misappropriation, involved CJ stealing an evidence dossier from an agent who had dirt on Tenpenny and his crew. Well, in this mission, CJ has to go and hand-deliver said dossier to Tenpenny and the boys. When he does deliver it, Tenpenny ends up knocking out Hernandez with a shovel for being a snitch, and then asks CJ to start digging and leaves Pulaski to sit and keep watch. It becomes obvious that the Crash team were conspiring to kill CJ as well as Hernandez, but before Pulaski can shoot and bury Carl, Hernandez gets up and tries to take down Pulaski, only to be killed. This results in Pulaski trying to flee, a car chase ensues, and the whole way through, Pulaski does nothing but talk a load of shit. Even his last words are aimed to get under CJ's skin.
I haven't talked too much about the other members of Crash, but they're an interesting case, and they feed into one of the main themes of the game, which I'll get into in a little while.
Hernandez is a classic good cop who wants to do good for his community, but is roped into bad shit by his corrupt superior officers, so you do feel kinda sorry for the guy, especially since he tries to fix things by snitching, only to get killed. Pulaski is essentially the other side of the same coin. He's basically one of Tenpenny's lackeys, but unlike Hernandez, he's in that role willingly. He's very obsequious, basically hanging on Tenpenny's every word and agreeing with everything he says. He's obviously very sadistic and enjoys occupying the role he's in. He's just an all-around scumbag who thinks he's more important than he really is, and walks all over CJ during the game, so this makes his death all the sweeter. While CJ is in Las Venturas, he also saves rapper Mad Dog from a suicide attempt. Yep, the same Mad Dog you had to steal from for OG Loc. This just makes OG Loc's missions feel even more pointless. But regardless, once CJ saves him, he takes him to hospital and Mad Dog goes into rehab to get clean. A few days later, Mad Dog shows up at the Four Dragons Casino and says he wants his mansion back, which he sold to drug kingpin Big Papa. No, not that one. Once CJ gets the mansion back, Torino calls him for one last mission. And once said mission is done, Torino sneaks up on Carl one last time and asks him to take a call. It's sweet, and he tells CJ that he's somehow being released. This is of course Torino's doing since he has friends in high places.
Honestly, if it wasn't for this moment, I'd probably hate Torino, but he actually pays CJ back for all of his hard work, so I guess it just goes to show he's not that bad a guy. Although what happens when you reach Sweet outside of the station is kinda questionable.
He just decides to chew CJ up and spit him out, calling him a perpetrator because he actually grew up, got out the hood, and made a name for himself. For those unaware, a perpetrator in slang terms is basically what someone would call a plastic gangster, aka OG Loc. OG Loc dresses, talks and acts gangster, or at least tries to, but in reality, he's never actually committed any notable crimes, as I mentioned earlier in the video. And I never really thought about this initially, but the fact Sweet says this makes no sense. CJ is as real as they come, and while he was behind bars getting fucked in the ass, CJ was out there doing some insane shit.
To help illustrate my point a little better, I'm going to play a clip from my boy Hugo One's video, Why Sweet is Garbage. I'm going to leave a link to the full video in the description, and you can subscribe to his channel too. He makes some great content, and yeah, it's worth supporting him.
He doesn't even care. Barely a few feet from jail, and he's already unhappy. So what can CJ do now? He only wants to please his brother, so they go back to the Grove and prepare to bang again. Sweet's #1 goal in life is to be a gangbanger. So he must be good at it, right? Wrong. He barely even makes an attempt to kill anybody. He stands directly in front of CJ, waving his hands in the air as if he's pretending they aren't being shot at by rival gang members. Okay, so maybe he's not good in the battlefield. He is the leader and sets a good example for all of the other gang members by showing them how a true Grove Street homie should act, right? Wrong. He tries to smoke crack almost immediately after CJ got his dumb ass out of prison.
Oh, what the hell you doing?
Honestly, I thought Hugo was talking out of his arse when he said this, but in my own experience, I've come to realise Sweet really does just fucking stand there waving his arms around.
I know the AI in PS2 era GTA games was dogshit at the best of times, but Jesus fucking Christ. Sweet honestly just fucking stands there and doesn't bother to start shooting until the ballers are super close, to the point where they'll either body him or CJ in just a couple of shots. But anyway, with no help from Sweet, you take back Grove Street and then set out to take over more territories from the Ballers and Vargos. During this time, CJ takes a little detour and helps Mad Dog track down OG Loke and helps him get his rhyme book back. Not long after this, Tenpenny is put on trial for the murder of Officer Pendlebury, but is let off scot-free due to insufficient evidence. This leads to the whole of Los Santos rioting. People are jacking cars, stealing TVs, beating each other up. There's no shortage of chaos. Sweet and CJ go back home to keep the Grove locked down, as to make sure that nobody wrecks their turf. Later, Caesar shows up at CJ's house, asking for his help to rebuild his gang, the Varios Los Aztecas, and take back the territories. After this is done and CJ takes back a few more territories for the Grove, they learn of Big Smoke's whereabouts and decide to take him out.
Break him.
This mission is intense. Hell, even the car ride there feels intense. The entire game has been building up to this point, and this is the first time you get to see Smoke since you learned of his betrayal.
The mission starts with CJ stealing a SWAT tank to take down the entrance to Big Smoke's crack palace, and then proceeding to climb up to the 4th floor to confront Smoke. The journey to the top of the crack palace is really intense and nerve-wracking. You're met with plenty of gang members with strong weapons on the way, and it really challenges your ability to strategically take out large groups of enemies. When CJ finally reaches the top, he's met by what I can only describe as a broken Smoke. He's very obviously paranoid, as mentioned by B-Dup in an earlier mission, and this is clear by the fact he's just sat around wearing body armor. He expected Carl's arrival and has accepted his imminent death. He seems like he doesn't even have a desire to carry on, which is evident from the fact he keeps playing his video game and just takes a rip from a bong before he even bothers to get up and get a gun. His ego is very obviously bruised too. He mentions to CJ how he seems to have everything, but immediately follows that up by stressing he is in fact a success and that no one can touch him.
This is honestly a really sad sight because as a player, when you initially meet Smoke, even though he may seem somewhat shady, he at least goes through the trouble of putting up a front, pretending to be that lovable and reliable and, trustworthy companion that CJ had from his childhood. Throughout the game, Smoke seems like somewhat of a mentor, so when you witness his betrayal, it's crushing. But then you get to see him again, and leading up to it, you're expecting a Big Smoke that's consumed by his ego and is on some kind of weird power trip where he thinks he's some kind of immortal being. But no, instead you're met by a broken man who knows full well that he betrayed his friends, partially because he had no choice and partially because of greed, which he admits during his final moments.
Before CJ can even mourn the loss of his former friend, Tenpenny shows up holding him at gunpoint and tells CJ he plans to escape. Tenpenny tries to kill CJ, but CJ tricks him and narrowly survives. Tenpenny then decides to cause an explosion in the building, forcing CJ to try his best to escape while dodging bullets and flames. Tenpenny then tries to flee in a fire truck, but Sweet hops on the back, and then CJ has to catch him in a car. The brothers are then chased and attacked by basically anyone and everyone in the city while they chase Tenpenny. Eventually Tenpenny swerves and crashes, falling through the bridge just above Grove Street. Carl approaches him with a gun, but Tenpenny is already dead. Everyone stands and stares at the sad sight that is Tenpenny. CJ then kicks over his dead body, letting him lie there like the sad, pathetic piece of shit that he is. We're met with a cute little cutscene back at the Johnson household with everyone celebrating, having a good time, before the credits roll.
The ending to this game is a fitting one. It's intense, epic, satisfying, but it's also bittersweet. Well, you basically end the game on top, owning multiple businesses, having a bunch of great friends, and being one of the highest ranking members in one of the biggest gangs in the city. It all still feels a tiny bit empty.
And that's because you don't get to share all of these things with the friends you thought you would have. You killed Smoke and Ryder, and it leaves the game with a bit of a somber note, because under all of the celebrating, CJ's probably hurting. And that's one of the things that makes this game so great, the fact that the story isn't so black and white and one note. The story does hit familiar story beats, but it tries its best to stray away from too many cliches, and the cliches that are used, either in the story or with certain characters, are tweaked and masked so well that they don't even feel like cliches anymore. The story doesn't follow any kind of rigid, straight or narrow path, but doesn't waste its time trying to baby the player either. Most players will take the game at face value, but some smarter, more attentive players will see the more subtle nuances of the story that really make it hit home for a lot of people. You see, you don't have to have lived the gangster lifestyle to connect with the story. Hell, you don't even have to have lived in the West Coast to connect with the story. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a childhood friend, a really good friend that you loved and really connected with, but as you grew older you didn't really connect as well? I feel like we've all experienced that in our lives. We've all had to take a break from or completely cut ties with friends or family because of disputes, or because we just drifted apart and grew to be very different people. I personally experienced this with a number of friends. Growing up I had a sizable group of friends, but I had to move away and leave them all behind. I later came back to the area where all of my friends lived, and went to high school with a number of them, but I'd found that a lot of these people had changed and become real arseholes. Some of these guys weren't the people I'd had all of these great nostalgic memories with. They were hateful and self-serving. And this is what CJ goes through in the game. He meets characters like Big Bear who are a shell of their former selves because of crack, or people like Big Smoke and Ryder who abandoned their gang and decided to serve themselves. As corny as it may sound, I connected a lot with this theme of change, for both the better and worse, when I was a child and a younger teen. There's a reason I dedicated a large chunk of this video to talk about the story, and that's because the story is great and pretty impactful. It's layered and well constructed, which is kind of surprising for a GTA game.
And hey, there's not just themes of loss and drifting apart from loved ones in the game, there's also other themes like corruption in the police force. It's arguably the most obvious theme in the game, next to the trials and tribulations of living the gangster lifestyle.
As mentioned before, the Crash team in San Andreas is very obviously a corrupt one, and shows examples of different kinds of corrupt cops. You have the good cop that was roped into the shady side of things, the corrupt psychopathic lackey who relishes in his position of power and the ability to use it for evil, and the corrupt superior officer who is only in the police force to step on those who he sees as below him. And let's talk about those initials that I've been mentioning throughout the video. Crash. This stands for Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. The Crash division was a real division of the LAPD, which was basically tasked with putting an end to gang-related violence. The real-life Crash, much like its fictional GTA counterpart, was highly corrupt, and from what I can understand, the game does a really good job at representing what real-life Crash officers were like. Hell, Tenpenny even uses one of their mottos. Believe it or not, the game actually goes even further with its police corruption theme, by mirroring the LA riots. The Los Santos riot scene in the game actually mirror the riots that occurred in the real world. Said riots were a response to the beating of the unarmed cab driver Rodney King. However, unlike the LA riots, the Los Santos riots don't really involve the conversation of race relations. Instead, the riots are a response to the corruption present in the LSPD. This is kinda smart because I think the game looking at race relations would have been a bad idea, because it would have muddied the waters of the story, and by removing said topic from the narrative entirely, it puts a greater emphasis on the theme of corruption in the police force.
I've been banging on about the setting and the story for ages, but what about the soundtrack? For many, it's one of those things that can make or break a GTA game, so how is it? Well, I wouldn't exactly call it the best in the franchise by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of solid, if not fantastic tracks here.
I know you got Soul, Rebel Without a Pause, Slow Ride, You Dropped a Bomb on Me, Strutter, Dre Day, White Wedding, Killing in the Name, Them Bones, Mother, Barracuda, Hold the Line, Eminence Front, Let It Whip, and of course, 3 massive tracks that have sort of become synonymous with this game: Ain't Nothing But a G-Fang by Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, Young Turks by Rod Stewart, and It Was a Good Day by Ice Cube.
Being a fan of rock and metal music, looking at the soundtrack, I'm kind of left wanting more, but I can see thematically why there was more of a focus on hip-hop and gangster rap, so I'm willing to excuse it. Now, I've mentioned a lot of things that make this game great, but there are also a lot of things that hold it back.
For example, there's plenty of popping during gameplay, and while some people do exaggerate how bad it is there. A lot of people cite the dated graphics too, and while I agree they are dated, they have a charm to them which I enjoy, but maybe I'm a little biased. I'm not going to bore you guys by going over the controls again, but they are definitely a product of their time and can take a minute to adjust to, even for returning players.
But even with all of the flaws present, this game just makes me feel something no other GTA game does. I want to say it's just pure nostalgia, but I'm nostalgic for other GTA games too, but they just don't make me feel what this game makes me feel. I can honestly just turn this game on and go for a ride around the state of San Andreas and have fun doing it. The seamless transition from area to area, the cool environments, the music, all of the aspects of this game just come together to make an experience that I feel the GTA franchise is yet to replicate. I recommend this game without a shadow of a doubt. Anyway guys, that's enough out of me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do feel free to leave a like, subscribe, share, do all of that good shit, because it helps me get that one step closer to being able to do this as a job, which is ultimately what I want. Thank you to Hugo One for letting me use a clip of his video. It was really cool of him, and yeah, feel free to check him out because he's fucking awesome. I'm sorry for like the shitty schedule and for how long this video took to come out, but I've been having a lot of health problems, as I mentioned in one of my previous videos. I've got like my sciatica is still acting up really bad, and I had to like record this video in a load of different segments. Like you probably noticed during the video, like my stubble changed and my hair changed, because that's like I'm filming this on a different day, which you can probably tell anyway, but yeah. And all of the, usually I can do voiceovers all in one sitting, or at least on camera segments all in one sitting. This was just impossible because my back was fucking killing me. It's still killing me right now, actually. So, you know, if you're feeling charitable, please do subscribe, share, you know, like, do all that shit. Hell, even leave a comment telling me what you thought about the video, because I do enjoy feedback and enjoy interacting with you guys. But yeah, I've got some more upcoming videos. I got a Q&A video coming up soon, so if you haven't seen that, the video for it yet, I'll leave the update Q&A video thing at some point in the video too. But yeah, basically just if you have any questions, feel free to comment your questions under that video, and I'll be sure to answer them in the upcoming Q&A video. Keep stumbling over my words, but yeah, that should be the next video that comes up. My next review, I'm not sure when that will drop. Hopefully it's a lot shorter one, because this long one really fucking did a number on my back. I sound like an old dude, but yeah. I don't want to keep you guys for too long, but yeah, if you did, again, if you did enjoy the video, please do, you know, support the video and support me, and you know, do all that shit. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram if you did. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing, and yeah, that's basically it off of the top of my head. I should have some smaller projects coming out soon too, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But anyway, I've been XYZCruncher. Stay cool, stay safe, stay crunchy, and I'm out. Peace.